This is part 2 of creating bubbles for champagne, and if you've been following along, we've completed creating a particle system in After Effects, and now we're ready to mask and apply special effects in the Photoshop file that we exported out. So on the desktop, we have our bubbles.psd file. So let's open that up in Photoshop. And once you have the Photoshop file open, you'll notice in the Layers panel, we have a Particles layer, which matches the name of the solid we created in After Effects that contains all of the particles. And we have the champagne glasses from the JPEG that we imported. So the first thing we're going to do is select the particles layer. Let's come down here and apply a layer mask. Then we're going to make sure we have black on the foreground and white on the background. We're going to select our paintbrush tool. Let's come up to the brush settings. Let's come in here and make sure we have a soft brush selected. I'll double click on soft round. Click away. I'm going to zoom up here. And what we're going to do is we're going to mask out all of the particles that appear outside of the glass. So if I come in here and start painting, I'm painting black on the layer mask, which is hiding all of the particles outside of the glass area. So I want to paint across the top here. Make sure these bubbles are going away. Then we're going to come over here and paint down the side. And I'm painting with a soft brush so that any of the particles on the edge of the glass will get a little bit of effects applied to them, so they'll look a little more natural. Then we're going to paint across the bottom here. Then over here on the left-hand side. And then I'll zoom out. I'll make my brush really large. And then I'll paint across the top here to get rid of all of the particles in the top of the composition. Now across the top of the liquid, I do want to set a harder brush so that we can get a sharper mask, because we're going to add bubbles to the top of the liquid in a few minutes. So let me decrease my brush size. Let's go back to the brush settings. Let's get a harder brush. Let's come back over here. And what I'm going to do is click on the left-hand side once, hold the Shift key, move my cursor all the way over to the right, click the mouse once, and that'll give me a nice straight line across the top. Now, if you want to see the mask you've drawn, you can hold the Option key on the Mac or Alt in Windows, come over here to the Layers panel, and with that key selected, let's click on the mask, and this will reveal the mask that you've painted. And so if you wanted to modify the mask, you can come in here and continue to draw and paint in any missing areas. Now to view the original image, let's go back to the Layers panel, click on the thumbnail icon here to the left, and that'll bring us back to the original image. And now to create the bubble effect, let's come over to the Layers panel. On the particles layer, let's come in here and change the fill opacity. Let's come in here and change this down to 0. This is not the opacity for the overall layer, but it is the fill opacity of the individual pixels on the layer. This way we can apply an effect and we'll only see the effect. We won't see the original particle pixels. Now I'll come in here and move my glass over here to the right. Then in the Layers panel with the particle layers selected, let's come down to the effects. Let's come in here and apply bevel and emboss. Now when the default settings are applied to those particles, which have a 0 fill opacity, you'll see the effect showing up on the canvas. So we don't see the pixels from the particles, but we see the results of the effect. So this already looks a little bit like bubbles. So let's come back to the bevel and emboss settings. For style, let's come in here and set this to emboss. For the depth, we're going to set this to just 1%. For the size, let's come in here and set this to 0. Same thing for soften. And by setting this to 0, we're going to get a much harder edge around the effect as it's applied to all of those pixels. So back in the bevel and emboss settings, under shading, we're going to keep this at 90 degrees, the altitude at 30, the gloss contour as a diagonal line, which is the first option here. Next, for the highlight mode, you want to set this to screen. You want to make sure that your color is set to white, and you're going to set the opacity to 50%. And for the shadow mode, let's come in here and change this from multiply to screen. Let's change the color to white. Let's click OK. And let's set the opacity up to about 85%, giving us the effect that the light is highlighting or shining on the inside of the bubbles. And now inside of the layer style dialog box, let's come in here and add a drop shadow. So let's come over here and check the checkbox. Then let's select the drop shadow. For the blend mode, we'll set this to multiply. For the color, let's click on the color swatch. Let's move into the canvas area. Let's select the sort of tan color of the champagne. And then let's come over here and diagonally drag this down to the lower right, making this darker and more saturated. I'm also going to come in here and just warm this up a little bit by dragging the slider down toward the reds. So once we have this sort of dark brown tan color, let's click OK. For the opacity, let's bring this up to about 38%. Let's leave the angle at 90. Let's change the distance to 2. Set the spread to 0. And then for the size, we'll set this to 0. And then we'll click OK for the layer style. So these are all of these styles that we're going to be applying to the particles layer. And now before we make the overall effect stronger, one thing we want to do is add some extra bubbles near the top of the liquid to make this look a little bit more realistic. So I'm going to zoom up here so that we can see the top of the liquid a little bit better. Let's come over and make sure we have the particles thumbnail selected, so we're not painting on the mask, but we're painting on the main layer. Let's go back to our paintbrush. Let's come up to our brush. Let's make sure we're on a hard brush. And just so we can see what we're painting, let's temporarily come back down to the fill opacity. Let's bring this back up to 100% so we can see all the black dots again. I'm going to hit the letter D on my keyboard, which will put black on the foreground and white on the background. So painting with black, let's come in here and decrease the brush size using your left bracket key. And I'm going to come in here and just start painting a bunch of bubbles by single clicking that brush along the top of the liquid. I'll hit my right bracket to increase the brush size a little bit. Then I'll decrease this a little bit. I just want to vary the size of all of these individual particles that we're painting. And then once I have a bunch of particles like this, let's come up here and select our marquee tool. Let's come in here and click and drag. I want to marquee select a bunch of these particles. Now I have this one particle half selected here, so I'll hold the Option key on the Mac or Alt in Windows and remove part of that selection. And now I'll come up and select the Move tool. I'm going to hold the Option key on the Mac or Alt in Windows and click and drag to create a copy of all of those bubbles. So I'll just drag this once, let go, I'll drag this again, this will give me another copy. With this still selected, I'm going to hit Command T on the Mac or Control T in Windows to transform these. And I'll just flip these around. If I hold the Option or Alt key, I can flip these around from the center. I can press Return. And still on the Move tool, I can move these over a little bit. Hold the Option key, let's drag another copy. Move these over, and then we'll do this one more time. So I'm just creating a series of bubbles across the top of the champagne. Next, I'll hit Command or Control D to deselect all of the particles. Now back in the Layers panel, let's set the fill opacity back to 0. Then I'm going to come in here and select the layer mask. I'm going to make sure I have white on the foreground. Let's select our brush tool. Let's come up here and make sure we have a hard brush selected. I'm going to increase this a little bit. I want to make sure that I don't have any masking happening inside of the liquid area. So now I'll zoom out a little bit. And to amplify this effect, to make the bubbles stronger, let's come back to the Layers panel. Let's select the Particles layer. Hit Command J on the Mac or Control J in Windows to duplicate that layer. And then on the duplicate, let's come back here to the main opacity and let's just bring this down to about 65%. And so now we've added bubbles to our champagne glass, making use of particle systems from After Effects, as well as some masking and layer effects inside of Photoshop.